This is Lakea, the librarian at the Vault of Nightmares. Your vault keeper is currently tied up right now, so I will be your host this evening. Hope you enjoy. The Boardwalk Bigfoot. I have always been a skeptic when it came to anything dealing with the supernatural, especially anything in the cryptid category. That is, until about a month ago, my family had been invited to go on a nature hike in Tennessee. That morning, we left the house about 7 a.m. and reached our destination about 45 minutes later. Myself, my wife, and the kids exited our vehicle and proceeded to put on our backpacks and grab our walkie-talkies and phones. Even though the sun was already over the horizon, the temperatures remained very mild. Since it was so early in the morning at this particular state park, we were the only people there at the time. The four of us set out on our hike through the woods. The boys, being teenagers that they are, decided to walk ahead, leaving me and my wife trailing behind. We had been hiking for about 10 minutes or so when we finally arrived at the boardwalk. This boardwalk in particular ran right through the middle of a swamp in the woods. It is about 2 to 3 feet wide, about 8/10 or so of a mile long, and at some places anywhere from 10 to 15 feet off the ground. We started across the boardwalk and were amazed by the scenery. By the time me and my wife were about 1/4 of the way into our walk, the kids radioed us to let us know they had completed the boardwalk. My wife and I kept the pace of a leisurely stroll until she immediately froze on the spot. We were at this spot about halfway through the boardwalk at an area of the swamp that was pretty clear vegetation-wise. There were wild ferns covering the ground and cypress trees scattered about. I stopped walking at this point and turned to my wife to see what had caught her attention. When I went to speak, she immediately told me to hush. She then took a step back, grabbed the side railing, and pointed off into the woods to the left of me. So I turned to where she was pointing, and I myself froze on the spot. About 100 yards to the left of where we were standing was something huge and black peeping around a tree at us. It wasn't a stump. It wasn't a broken limb from the cypress trees. And I know this for a fact because I saw it move. Me and my wife, while standing there, actually saw this creature step out from behind the tree into the clearing and just stand there staring back at us. It had been a good 8 feet in height or better compared to how high we were off the ground on the boardwalk, and also compared to the tall cypress tree it had just stepped out from behind. I could even see the shaggy hair hanging off its body in random places where its chest and arms were. The three of us must have stared at each other for a minute or more before I turned back to my wife to ask her was she really seeing the same thing that I was. She broke her gaze from the creature, looked me dead in my eyes, and simply said, "Yes, I see it too." When we both turned back around, it was gone. No dark mass, no stump, no shadow, no nothing, and especially no creature. It took us about another minute of just standing there eyeing these surroundings before the silence was broken. My wife was the first to speak. Her statement was just one simple sentence, and at first, hearing it, I was in total shock, but also in absolute agreement. She said to me, "Honey, I think I just saw Bigfoot." We looked around the area one more time, seeing nothing, before we decided that we really needed to catch up to the teens at this point. Our leisurely stroll turned into a really fast-paced walk the rest of the way across the boardwalk. By this time, we had completely forgotten about having walkie-talkies on us due to the fright. When we finally reached the end of the boardwalk to where the kids were, me and the wife were both out of breath. We gathered ourselves together for a moment before asking the boys if they were okay, and how did their walk go. The oldest teen told us that while they were waiting for us at the end of the boardwalk, a lot of rustling of leaves could be heard to their left a few minutes before we had reached them. The youngest boy jumped into the conversation then, saying he had seen a huge black shadow run by really fast at the edge of the tree line where the rustling sound came from. He said he didn't know what it was, but that he was just telling his older brother about it. Me and the wife just looked at each other and at that moment basically mentally agreed not to tell the boys what we had seen until we were out of the swamp and headed back home. At that point, I feigned feeling ill and decided to cut the hike short. All four of us turned around and proceeded to walk all together back across the swamp on the boardwalk and back to the car. Needless to say, it was a very interesting car ride back home. And thank you for letting me be able to share our experience of the Boardwalk Bigfoot. The Case of the Missing Cats. My name is John, and I live on the south side of a small town. I own about 2 acres of land with several barns, some farm equipment, and a small pond. I was thinking about buying a couple of cows to put on the land around the pond, but I am not so sure anymore. It started out with the mice problem in my barns. I was letting one of the neighbors up the road store their horse feed in one of my barns. This made the field mice come in droves to my property. So I asked the local co-op manager, what should I do? He suggested that I get me several cats to live outside so they could take care of the mice problems. The co-op manager gave me the phone number of a lady who was trying to give her cats away. The next day, I called the lady with the cats and agreed to take all 7 of them. She said they were outdoor cats already, so I shouldn't have any problem with them adjusting to a new place. That afternoon, I picked up the 7 cats in an old cage I found in one of the barns. I brought them home and turned them loose. I set out several buckets of water for them so they wouldn't have to go all the way to the pond all the time. The lady had given me several bags of cat food, so I sprinkled some out in the barn so that the cats would get used to being in them. The first week went fine. They caught mice, strolled the land, and followed me around. It was about the middle of the second week when I noticed that 2 of the cats hadn't been around. After the 3rd day of them being missing, I decided to walk over the 2 acres calling for them. As I approached the pond, I noticed little patches of fur here and there as I walked. My first thought was that 2 of the cats had gotten into a fight. I took a few more steps and laying there, lifeless, was one of the cats. Not to be extremely graphic, but it looked like something had literally taken a bite out of its middle and then just threw it down. I looked around the area and then decided to finish walking around the pond before I headed back to bury the cat. I was still finding bits of fur here and there every couple of feet, but then I noticed some of the hair didn't match the cat I had came across. I reached down to grab some of the fur to examine it, and that's when I noticed the blood. But it wasn't the blood that caught my eye. It was the footprint that the blood had pulled in, and the blood was still fresh. I stood back up quickly and started scanning the ground where I stood. There had been at least a dozen or more prints all over the ground, and they were huge. I could even see the toe and heel indentions in the ground. I myself wear a size 13 shoe, but the size of the footprints were so large that I didn't realize I had been stepping inside the prints as I had walked around the pond. The ground around my pond is naturally soft anyway, but these prints went into the ground several inches. I have never seen any prints this big before. Needless to say, I turned, walked back to the cat on the ground, grabbed it by its hind legs, and headed for the house. When I got back, I buried the cat, fed the others, and went inside, shaken. Over the next week, one by one, the rest of the cats started turning up missing. As I made my rounds around the property each day, I noticed more and more prints, getting closer and closer to the barns, to the house. When I went inside one morning and walked to the barn, I noticed that not one cat ran to me for a treat or a handful of food. I called, "Kitty, kitty," but none came. I did my chores, and as I was heading back out of the barn, I seen them. More of those huge footprints. 2 more days went by, and none of the cats had shown back up. In my gut, I knew they wouldn't be coming back. Over time, and after a few storms, the prints disappeared. I never did see any more footprints. I also never saw any of those cats again. Bigfoot family ties. My daughter and her friend told me this a few years ago, so I thought it might be of some interest to you. What I am about to tell you occurred one Friday evening. I was a single parent, so I was having to work late to try to provide for my daughter and myself by working overtime when I could. We had just moved into my family's old home the week prior to this occurrence. Since it was a Friday, my daughter was having a friend stay over. They both were to ride the bus home together to my house and stay there, locked inside until I got off work in a few hours. When they were safely inside the house, my daughter sent me a text letting me know that they were at the house safe and sound. My daughter also stated that they were going to chill out and watch a movie or 2 until I got home. I replied that that was fine, and that was the end of the conversation. I went back to working, and after about an hour, there was a severe thunderstorm warning that came across the radio we had at work. I texted my daughter and gave her a heads up about the weather. She said she would keep an eye out and that she would see me when I got home, and for me not to worry. She was 16, by the way, when all of this occurred, so like every other teenager, she thought she was grown. I didn't hear from her again until I actually arrived home about 2 hours later. When I pulled into the driveway, the rain was starting to slack off and the wind was calming down. I quickly unlocked the front door and announced to myself so I wouldn't startle the girls. As I was sitting my keys and my purse down on the entryway table, both girls came running up to me. They were both out of breath, shaking, and I could tell that they had been crying. Tear stains were still visible on their cheeks. I immediately asked them what was wrong. My daughter spoke first. She said, "Mom, we were sitting here watching a scary movie when I got your text. Then we started hearing banging on the back window over there. We thought it was just the wind and the storm, so we kept on watching the movie. The banging kept on. It was thundering and lightning, so I ignored the banging. After 5 minutes passed, Amy said she was still hearing it too. And I was too. So we got up off the couch and walked over to the window to see what was making all the banging. I thought the wind had blown something up against the house. At this point, my daughter started crying again, so I walked her and her friend Amy over to the couch and had them sit down. I sat down on the coffee table across from them and asked my daughter to continue telling me what had happened, because I was starting to get worried about what had happened while I was gone. I leaned close to the window, Mom. Amy was on the other side of me trying to help me look. Then there was a big streak of lightning. When the sky lit up, we could see the outside through the window. A face was looking back at us, Mom. At this point, I looked over at Amy and asked her what did she see. She told me she seen a huge face close to the window. She said that both girls jumped back and screamed. Then there was another bang on the window. This time, since they were so close to it that she could hear the actual window rattle from the bang. Then the lightning flashed again. Amy said the face was still there. She said it looked like a huge ape. She said the face was very hairy and it looked like its hair was matted and muddy. I looked back over at my daughter and asked her did she see what Amy had been describing. She said she had. My daughter told me that her and Amy had grabbed each other at this point, screamed again, and ran to my closet. She said they stayed hidden there until she heard me come home and call out to them. I asked her why she didn't call me, and she replied that her phone had been left in the living room, and neither one of them wanted to leave the closet. At first I found this really hard to believe. The window they were talking about was around 6 feet off the ground at the bottom of the sill, but the thought of a peeping Tom terrified me. Then it registered with me what Amy had said about it having an ape-like hairy face, something familiar. But at that time I couldn't put my finger on it. I reassured the girls and I went around the whole house checking every window and door to make sure that they were locked. Then I decided to distract the girls by having them help me cook dinner. We cooked, we ate, and that night we all ended up in my bed. The next morning before the girls awoke, I went outside, around the house and to the back window. I was baffled at what I saw. There were no limbs or branches, but there was mud all down the window with finger marks and mud streaks all down the side of the house. I knew the girls were already terrified, so I went and got the ladder out of the shed and dragged the water hose around. I washed the lower part first as high as I could reach. When I climbed the ladder to wash the mud from the window and the upper part, I realized that there were finger smears were as big as my head on the window pane. I quickly finished up and replaced the ladder and hose. When I got back inside, the girls were still sleeping, so I called my dad. After my mother died last year, he went downhill, so he now stays at a nursing home. He answered the phone, we chatted a bit, and then I told him about what my daughter and Amy had told me. He grew quiet on the phone, so at first I thought he was having one of his episodes. Finally, he spoke. He asked me if I remembered anything from when I was around the age of 5. I thought about it for a second before replying, not much. I remember playing outside all the time over by the oak trees. I remember I had a favorite doll named Susie. Other than those two things, which I thought was normal for every little girl, nothing else stuck out. Then my father asked me if I remembered the day I had disappeared. I told him no, not right off the top of my head. He told me to go sit down and that he was going to tell me about it. He said I was around 5 years old and I had been outside all morning playing at my favorite spot with my doll under the trees. He had been outside with me, working in the garden, while my mother had been in the house cooking. He said he went inside to get us something to drink, and that when he came back outside, I was gone. My father told me that he yelled for my mother, and that they searched everywhere. He said just when they were giving up hope and going to call the sheriff is when I walked out of the woods by the oak trees where I played. Supposedly they both ran up to me, grabbed me up and hugged me, and then asked me why I went into the woods where I was told not to go. What he told me next sent a cold chill down my spine. My father said I told him I didn't walk into the woods, that a big mom monkey picked me up and took me to her baby. She sat me down under some trees and that her baby came over and tried to play with me, like I played with my doll. My father asked how I got back home, and I told him and my mom that the big baby monkey fell asleep, so the mom lay down with it and I just got up and walked away. My mom, Dad said, asked me how I found my way to the house, and I told her I heard them yelling for me. My father then told me on the phone that him and my mother didn't believe me at first until they were turning to take me into the house, and that's when he seen them. About an 8-foot or so Bigfoot and her baby, standing at the edge of the wood line, watching us. He said that was the only time he ever saw them, and after a while, I didn't mention them again, and neither did he or my mom. I sat in shock for a few seconds after he told me all of this. I finally hung up with him after saying our goodbyes and just sat there processing everything. Now I know why what the girls had explained to me seemed so familiar, and I think what they saw was probably the baby now bigger, or the baby of the one I was taken to. We never go outside at night anymore, and my daughter is counting the days until she will be moving away to college. But I have to say, we have not had anything happen since.